For more than 60 years, Burkina Faso watched its wealth leave the country in its most basic form. Gold was dug from the ground but refined elsewhere. Cotton was harvested from the fields but turned into fabric in foreign factories. Farmers worked under the hot Sahel sun, yet much of the value created from their labor ended up thousands of miles away. Now imagine something different. Imagine a market of 1.4 billion consumers suddenly opening its doors to Burkina Faso. Imagine those doors opening without tariffs, without many of the barriers that have traditionally limited African exports. For many observers, that announcement from China was the headline. But the real story may not be happening in Beijing at all. The real story may be unfolding in Ouagadougou. Because while China was opening a market, Ibrahim Traore was preparing something else. He was preparing Burkina Faso to enter that market differently than before. Before we explore that possibility, it is important to understand what Burkina Faso has been trying to escape for decades. The country followed a familiar pattern seen across much of Africa. Raw materials left. Wealth left with them. Cotton was exported as cotton. Gold was exported as gold. Agricultural products were exported with little processing. The countries that bought those resources often earned far more by refining, manufacturing, packaging, and selling finished products than Burkina Faso earned from producing the resources themselves. That reality created a painful contradiction. Burkina Faso was rich in resources but struggled to translate those resources into widespread prosperity. The problem was never the absence of wealth beneath the soil. The problem was the inability to capture enough value before that wealth crossed the border. Today, that may finally be starting to change. China's decision to grant zero-tariff access to African exports is being described by many economists as one of the most significant trade openings in modern African history. For Burkina Faso, the announcement was especially important because it offered something that previous generations rarely had: direct access to one of the largest consumer markets on Earth. A market of 1.4 billion people changes the conversation. For years, African nations were often told that development depended on aid packages, loans, or foreign assistance programs. China presented something different. Instead of offering a donation, it offered market access. Instead of promising support in the future, it reduced barriers that had previously made trade more difficult. That distinction matters. Aid can help solve temporary problems. Access to customers can create long-term economic growth. Under the new arrangement, products from Burkina Faso can enter China with significant advantages compared to many previous trade conditions. For farmers, exporters, and manufacturers, that creates opportunities that simply did not exist before. But it is important to understand what this policy does and does not do. Zero tariffs do not automatically make a country rich. They do not build factories. They do not train workers. They do not create industrial capacity. What they do is open a door. And history shows that open doors only benefit nations that are prepared to walk through them. This is why the story becomes much more interesting when we shift our attention from Beijing to Burkina Faso itself. China has provided access to the market. The question is what Burkina Faso intends to sell inside that market. If the country continues exporting mostly raw materials, the gains may be limited. Raw cotton, raw gold, and unprocessed agricultural products generate far less value than finished goods. But if Burkina Faso can export refined gold, textiles, processed foods, and manufactured products, then the impact of zero tariffs becomes far more powerful. The opportunity is real. The challenge is real as well. And that challenge is exactly where Ibrahim Traore enters the story. Ibrahim Traore appears to understand a reality that many resource-rich countries have struggled to overcome. Having valuable resources is not enough. The real question is, who captures the value created from those resources? For decades, Burkina Faso exported gold and cotton while most of the higher value activities happened elsewhere. Refining, manufacturing, branding, packaging, and large-scale distribution were often controlled outside the country. As a result, Burkina Faso participated in global trade, but remained near the bottom of the value chain. Traore has repeatedly argued that this model cannot continue if the country hopes to achieve genuine economic sovereignty. His approach is built around a simple idea. Burkina Faso should not only extract resources, it should process them. One of the clearest examples is gold. Instead of sending large amounts of gold abroad for refining, the government has supported the creation of a national gold refinery. The goal is not merely symbolic. Refining gold inside Burkina Faso allows more economic activity to remain within the country. It creates jobs, develops technical expertise, improves oversight, and potentially increases government revenue. The same thinking is visible in the mining sector more broadly. Through state participation and greater control over strategic resources, the government is attempting to ensure that national wealth contributes more directly to national development. But perhaps the most important aspect of Traore's vision is not a specific project. It is a change in mindset. For generations, many African economies were encouraged to focus on extraction, produce raw materials, export them, import finished goods. Traore is challenging that formula. He is asking a different question. What happens when the country that grows the cotton also produces the fabric? What happens when the country that mines the gold also refines the gold? What happens when economic value stays closer to the people who create it? Those questions are becoming increasingly important because China has now opened a market that may reward countries capable of producing more than raw materials. And that is exactly why the next stage of Burkina Faso's strategy may prove even more important than the first. If gold represents Burkina Faso's mineral wealth, cotton represents its opportunity to build a modern industrial economy. For decades, Burkina Faso has been one of West Africa's major cotton producers. Every year, farmers grow and harvest cotton across the country. Yet the biggest profits have rarely stayed in Burkina Faso. The reason is simple. Cotton was often exported as a raw material. Once it left the country, the next stages of production happened elsewhere. Foreign factories turned cotton into yarn. Yarn became fabric. Fabric became clothing. Each step added value, created jobs, and generated profits outside Burkina Faso. This is the cycle that Ibrahim Traore wants to change. One of the most important symbols of that effort is the IRO Tex Burkina textile project. The goal is not simply to build another factory. The goal is to create a larger industrial chain inside Burkina Faso. The vision follows a clear path. Cotton becomes yarn. Yarn becomes fabric. Fabric becomes finished products. Every stage creates additional value. Every stage creates more employment opportunities. Every stage allows more money to remain inside the national economy. This is how many successful manufacturing nations developed. They did not become wealthy simply because they possessed natural resources. They became wealthy because they learned how to process those resources themselves. The difference can be enormous. A single bale of cotton provides income mainly for the farmer who produces it. A textile industry supports farmers, factory workers, transport companies, technicians, managers, and exporters at the same time. That is why industrialization matters so much to Burkina Faso's future. And if China's tariff-free market remains open, Burkina Faso may eventually export textiles and finished products instead of raw cotton alone. If that happens, the country will not simply be selling resources. It will be selling value, jobs, and economic strength created at home. History is full of nations that missed great opportunities because they were not prepared when those opportunities arrived. Burkina Faso is attempting something different. At almost the exact moment China opened its market to African exports, Burkina Faso began taking steps to increase domestic processing, strengthen industrial capacity, and gain greater control over its resources. Whether by design or coincidence, these two developments are now intersecting in a way that could reshape the country's economic future. Think about the situation from a strategic perspective. China has created access to one of the largest consumer markets in the world. That opportunity alone is significant. But market access only becomes transformative when producers have something valuable to sell. This is where Traore's economic vision becomes important. The National Gold Refinery, textile projects, and efforts to expand local processing are all attempts to ensure that Burkina Faso enters global markets with higher value products rather than raw materials alone. In many ways, this is a story about preparation meeting opportunity. For decades, Burkina Faso had resources but lacked sufficient industrial capacity. Now, industrial capacity is beginning to emerge just as a major export market becomes more accessible. That combination does not guarantee success. There are still major challenges ahead. Factories must become productive. Workers must be trained. Infrastructure must improve. Investment must continue. But opportunities of this scale do not appear every generation. That is why many supporters of Traore believe the current moment may represent a historic turning point. Not because China is offering special favors, not because prosperity is guaranteed, but because Burkina Faso may finally have a chance to move from exporting what it has to exporting what it creates. China opened the door. Traore is trying to build the road that leads to it. And for the first time in many decades, those two developments are happening at the same time. Not everyone is convinced that Burkina Faso is moving in the right direction. Critics in Western policy circles often argue that the country may simply be replacing one dependency with another. According to this view, moving away from France while building closer economic ties with China does not automatically create economic sovereignty. It merely changes the identity of the external partner. Others argue that China is primarily interested in access to African resources and new markets for Chinese products. They point to trade imbalances and warn that African countries could remain suppliers of raw materials if they fail to industrialize. These concerns deserve serious consideration. However, there is another side to the debate. Every major power pursues its own interests. France did. Britain did. The United States does. China does as well. The real question is not whether China benefits. The real question is whether Burkina Faso benefits at the same time. That answer will depend on what happens inside Burkina Faso over the next several years. If the country continues exporting mainly raw gold, raw cotton, and unprocessed agricultural products, many critics may be proven correct. But if Burkina Faso succeeds in refining its gold, expanding textile production, and developing local processing industries, the outcome could look very different. In that scenario, China would not simply become a buyer of resources, it would become a customer for products carrying more value created inside Burkina Faso itself. Ultimately, the debate is not about China versus the West. It is about whether Burkina Faso can finally move higher in the global value chain and capture more of the wealth generated by its own resources. The story of Burkina Faso is not really about tariffs. It is not even primarily about China. It is about what a nation chooses to do when a rare opportunity appears. For more than 60 years, Burkina Faso exported raw materials while much of the value created from those materials was captured elsewhere. Gold left the country. Cotton left the country. agricultural products left the country. The resources were Burkinabe, but the greatest rewards often were not. Today, the situation may be changing. China has opened a market of 1.4 billion consumers. For the first time, Burkina Faso has access to an enormous commercial opportunity with fewer barriers than ever before. But history teaches us that open markets alone do not create prosperity. Factories create prosperity. Skills create prosperity. Industrial capacity creates prosperity. That is why the actions of Ibrahim Traore matter so much in this moment. While many people focus on the open door in China, Traore has been focused on preparing what Burkina Faso will carry through that door. Gold refining, textile production, agricultural processing. These are not simply economic projects. They are attempts to keep more value inside the country and build a stronger foundation for future generations. The outcome is still uncertain. The challenges remain enormous. But for the first time in decades, Burkina Faso is trying to move beyond the role of a supplier of cheap raw materials and toward the role of a producer of higher value goods. Whether that vision succeeds or fails will shape the future of the country for years to come. And perhaps that is the lesson for Africa New, for the Pan-African movement, for the African Union, and for every nation seeking greater economic sovereignty. The goal is not simply to own resources. The goal is to transform those resources into lasting prosperity. That is the vision many supporters see in Captain Ibrahim Traore, in Burkina Faso, in Pan-Africanism, and in the broader hopes surrounding Ibrahim Traore's economic agenda. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to subscribe, share your thoughts in the comments, and join us as we continue exploring the stories shaping the future of Africa. For 18 long years, the Lumbila seed farm stood as a symbol of unrealized potential. Built to help strengthen Burkina Faso's agricultural future, the site gradually lost much of its usefulness when reliable irrigation became unavailable. Year after year, farmers watched fertile land remain underused, waiting for a solution that never seemed to come. What made the situation even more frustrating was that everyone understood the importance of the farm. It was not just another agricultural project. It was a strategic source of quality seeds that could help thousands of producers improve their harvests. Then something changed. Under the leadership of Captain Ibrahim Traore, the long period of waiting finally came to an end. Water returned to the fields of Lumbila, opening the door to year-round production and giving new life to a site that many feared would never regain its former importance. But this story is about much more than irrigation pipes and pumping stations. It is about a nation attempting to build its future through its own efforts, its own resources, and its own determination. Before we continue, make sure to subscribe to the channel because stories like this reveal how real development is taking shape across Africa in ways that often receive little international attention. The history of Lumbila stretches back decades. The reservoir that supplies the area was created in 1947, while the seed farm itself was established in 1975. In 2001, it received official recognition as a seed production farm by the Food and Agriculture Organization. For years, it played an important role in supporting agricultural production. However, by 2008, the lack of adequate irrigation infrastructure had severely limited operations. Farmers could only work effectively during the rainy season, leaving valuable land idle for much of the year. What was once a promising agricultural asset slowly became an example of how infrastructure neglect can prevent a country from fully benefiting from its own resources. Burkina Faso's agricultural sector sits at the center of the nation's economy and the daily lives of millions of citizens. For decades, agriculture has provided employment and income for the majority of the population. Yet, despite its importance, the sector has faced enormous challenges that have limited its ability to fully meet the country's food needs. One of the greatest obstacles has been the heavy dependence on rainfall. In many parts of Burkina Faso, agricultural success depends almost entirely on whether the rainy season arrives on time and delivers enough water. When rains are delayed or insufficient, harvests suffer. Entire communities can find themselves facing uncertainty about food supplies and income. Climate change has made these challenges even more difficult. Rising temperatures, irregular rainfall patterns, and longer periods of drought have increased the risks faced by farmers. A single poor season can affect thousands of families and reduce production across entire regions. In such conditions, relying only on natural rainfall becomes increasingly dangerous. At the same time, security challenges in several parts of the country have disrupted agricultural activities. Some farming communities have been displaced, while others have struggled to maintain normal production levels. These pressures have placed additional strain on food systems that were already vulnerable. As a result, Burkina Faso has often faced difficult questions about food security. How can a nation strengthen its agricultural independence when weather conditions are unpredictable? How can farmers increase production while facing environmental and security pressures? The answer increasingly points toward greater investment in agricultural infrastructure, irrigation systems, and quality seed production. This is precisely why the revival of Lumbila matters so much. The project is not simply about restoring one farm, it addresses some of the most fundamental challenges facing Burkina Faso. Reliable water supplies and high-quality seeds provide farmers with tools that reduce uncertainty and increase productivity. In a country where agriculture remains essential to national stability, such investments represent more than economic projects. They become strategic instruments for building resilience, strengthening food security, and creating a more self-reliant future. The revival of Lumbila cannot be fully understood without examining the broader vision that has emerged under Captain Ibrahim Traore. For many observers, the restoration of a seed farm may appear to be a local development project, yet within Burkina Faso, it represents something much larger. It reflects a growing belief that national sovereignty begins with the ability of a country to feed itself. Since coming to power, Ibrahim Traore has consistently emphasized the importance of economic independence and domestic production. His message has been simple but powerful. A nation that depends heavily on others for essential needs can never exercise complete control over its future. This philosophy extends beyond politics and security. It reaches into agriculture, industry, education, and resource management. In many ways, this approach echoes ideas that were promoted decades earlier by Thomas Sankara. Sankara argued that African nations should rely on their own capacities rather than remain dependent on external assistance. While the circumstances of today are different, the underlying principle remains familiar. Development must be built on local strengths and local production. Lumbila fits perfectly within this vision. Rather than creating an entirely new project from scratch, the government focused on restoring an existing national asset that had been neglected for years. This approach sends an important message. Progress does not always require expensive new initiatives. Sometimes it begins by identifying valuable resources that already exist and ensuring they function properly. The project also reflects a shift from short-term solutions toward long-term productive capacity. Instead of simply addressing immediate food shortages, the goal is to strengthen the foundations of agricultural production itself. Water infrastructure, quality seeds, and organized farming cooperatives create conditions that can continue generating results for years to come. For supporters of Ibrahim Traore, Lumbila demonstrates what can happen when political priorities are aligned with practical needs. The farm's recovery is not merely about increasing agricultural output. It symbolizes a broader effort to transform Burkina Faso from a nation struggling with recurring vulnerabilities into one capable of producing more of what its people need. In that sense, the water flowing once again through Lumbila's fields represents more than irrigation. It represents a vision of self-reliance taking shape on the ground. The transformation of Lumbila became visible the moment water began flowing through the newly completed irrigation system. After 18 years of limited operations, the farm suddenly gained something it had lacked for nearly 2 decades, the ability to produce throughout the entire year. The scale of the project is significant. The irrigated area covers 60 hectares and has been divided into 240 plots that will be managed by agricultural cooperatives. Water is supplied from the Lumbila reservoir through a pumping station equipped with 3 motor pumps. A network of canals and distribution infrastructure now ensures that water can reach fields that previously depended almost entirely on seasonal rainfall. For local farmers, this development changes everything. Instead of waiting for the rainy season to begin planting, they can now organize production schedules more effectively and take advantage of multiple growing cycles. Officials estimate that the site will be capable of producing approximately 48.5 tons of quality seeds each season. Those seeds will support farmers far beyond Lumbila itself, helping improve agricultural productivity across wider regions of Burkina Faso. During the inauguration ceremony, government officials emphasized that the project is not simply an engineering achievement, it is a strategic investment in the future of national agriculture. Minister of Economy Abubakar Nakanabo stressed that quality seeds form the foundation of agricultural success. Without reliable seeds, even fertile land and favorable weather cannot guarantee strong harvests. Captain Ismail Sambi also delivered a clear message to beneficiaries. He reminded farmers that the infrastructure had required substantial public investment, and that protecting it would be essential. The long-awaited return of water created tremendous opportunities, but those opportunities could only be sustained through responsible management and collective discipline. What makes the Lumbila project particularly remarkable is that it converts an underutilized resource into a productive asset. For years, the farm represented unrealized potential. Today, it stands as evidence that targeted investments in infrastructure can unlock economic opportunities that have been dormant for decades. The return of water has not simply revived fields. It has revived confidence, expectations, and the possibility of a more productive agricultural future. Many people hear about irrigation systems and seed farms without fully understanding why they are so important. Yet, throughout history, agricultural transformations have often begun with one simple factor: better seeds. Long before modern machinery or advanced technologies, farmers discovered that the quality of what they planted determined much of what they harvested. This reality remains true in Burkina Faso today. Quality seeds are the foundation of productive agriculture. They influence crop yields, resistance to disease, tolerance to environmental stress, and overall food production. Even when farmers have access to land and water, poor quality seeds can severely limit results. Conversely, improved seeds can significantly increase productivity without requiring additional farmland. That is why the restoration of Lumbila carries such strategic value. The farm is expected to produce approximately 48.5 tons of seeds each season. These seeds are not intended solely for local use. They are part of a broader effort to strengthen agricultural production throughout the country. The importance of this goal becomes even clearer when viewed within the framework of Burkina Faso's offensive agro-pastoral and fisheries initiative. This national strategy seeks to expand food production, improve agricultural resilience, and reduce dependence on external supplies. Achieving those objectives requires more than ambitious speeches. It requires reliable inputs that farmers can depend on year after year. Seeds represent one of those critical inputs. By increasing the availability of high-quality seeds, Lumbila helps create a multiplier effect throughout the agricultural sector. Better seeds support stronger harvests. Stronger harvests improve food security. Improved food security strengthens economic stability and reduces vulnerability to external shocks. For this reason, the return of water to Lumbila should not be viewed as the final achievement. It is the beginning of a process. The true success of the project will be measured in the growing number of farmers who gain access to better seeds and the increasing ability of Burkina Faso to feed itself through its own production. As the Lumbila project gained attention, it also attracted criticism from some observers outside Burkina Faso. This reaction was not surprising. Major development initiatives often become part of larger debates about politics, governance, and national priorities. In the case of Burkina Faso, some critics questioned whether projects like Lumbila would remain sustainable over the long term. Others suggested that such achievements were being highlighted primarily for political purposes. However, the strongest response to these criticisms comes not from speeches, but from results. For 18 years, the farm struggled to operate at full capacity. Today, it has access to irrigation, organized production plots, pumping infrastructure, and the ability to support year-round cultivation. These are measurable changes, not theoretical promises. The voices of local farmers provide another important perspective. For many beneficiaries, the project represents the difference between seasonal production and continuous agricultural activity. Their focus is not on international political debates. Their focus is on whether water reaches their fields and whether they can improve their livelihoods. This does not mean every concern should be dismissed. Long-term maintenance, effective management, and continued investment will remain essential. Yet the experience of Lumbila demonstrates an important principle. Development projects should ultimately be judged by their impact on people's lives. When farmers gain new opportunities, when production increases, and when communities become more resilient, those outcomes provide a powerful answer to skepticism. 18 years of waiting finally came to an end at Lumbila. For nearly 2 decades, a valuable agricultural asset remained unable to reach its full potential because of one fundamental limitation: the lack of reliable water. Today, that reality has changed. Water flows through the irrigation network. Farmers can cultivate throughout the year, and a seed farm once restricted to seasonal production has been given a new future. Yet the importance of Lumbila extends far beyond 60 hectares of land. The project demonstrates what can happen when a nation chooses to invest directly in productive capacity rather than depend entirely on external solutions. By restoring irrigation, improving access to quality seeds, and supporting cooperative farming, Burkina Faso is strengthening the foundations of long-term food security. The lessons reach beyond national borders. Many African countries possess fertile land, hardworking farmers, and untapped resources. What often limits progress is not a lack of potential, but a lack of infrastructure, organization, and sustained commitment. Lumbila shows that meaningful change can begin by restoring neglected assets and placing local production at the center of development policy. For many supporters, this achievement reflects the broader vision promoted by Ibrahim Traore. It is a vision that emphasizes self-reliance, productive investment, and confidence in the abilities of African people. In that sense, Lumbila has become more than a seed farm. It has become a symbol of an Africa new that seeks growth through its own efforts and its own resources. Its story resonates with the ideals of Pan-African cooperation, the aspirations of the African Union, and the enduring principles of Pan-Africanism. Whether viewed through the lens of agriculture, economic development, or national renewal, Lumbila offers an example of what is possible when determination is matched by action. As Burkina Faso continues this journey under Captain Ibrahim Traore, many across Africa will be watching closely. If you enjoyed this story, share your thoughts below and subscribe to the channel for more insights into the transformation taking place across the continent. Have you noticed something unusual happening across the Sahel? While Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger continue to strengthen their position against armed extremist groups, another battle appears to be taking shape far from the front lines. It is not a battle fought with rifles or military vehicles. Instead, it is a battle for influence, ideas, and public perception. In recent months, debates surrounding religion, political authority, and social identity have become increasingly visible across the region. Some see these tensions as normal disagreements within society. Others believe they may be part of a broader effort to weaken the alliance of Sahel states from within. This raises an important question. If extremist groups are finding it harder to achieve their objectives through direct violence, could new strategies be emerging that focus on division rather than confrontation? To understand this concern, we must first examine the changing reality of the Sahel. For years, Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger have faced relentless attacks from armed groups. Villages were targeted, communities displaced, and thousands of families affected by insecurity. In response, the three countries increased military cooperation and created the Alliance of Sahel States, seeking greater control over their own security and future. As military operations expanded, many observers noticed a new challenge beginning to emerge. The struggle was no longer limited to physical territory. Attention increasingly shifted toward information, ideology, and social cohesion. History shows that when direct pressure becomes less effective, efforts often move toward influencing public opinion. A society divided by mistrust can be weakened without a single shot being fired. This is why the growing controversy surrounding extremist religious narratives has attracted so much attention across the Sahel. In the next section, we will examine how extremist messages can transform social frustrations into deeper divisions and why many leaders consider this a major national security concern. Across Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger, discussions about religion have become increasingly sensitive. The reason is simple. Leaders across the Sahel are no longer looking only at armed attacks. They are also examining the ideas that can inspire those attacks. Many security experts argue that extremism rarely begins with violence. It often begins with a narrative. A message is repeated often enough that it slowly changes how people see themselves, their neighbors, and their country. The process usually starts by creating a feeling of victimhood. Individuals are told that their faith is under attack, that their community is being marginalized, or that political leaders are working against their beliefs. Whether these claims are true or not becomes less important than the emotions they create. Once this sense of grievance takes hold, society can begin to divide. People stop seeing themselves primarily as citizens of one nation and begin seeing themselves as members of opposing groups. Trust weakens, suspicion grows. Every government decision is interpreted through a religious or ideological lens. This is where extremist recruiters often find opportunities. They present themselves as defenders of faith, justice, and identity. They offer simple answers to complex problems. Young people facing insecurity, unemployment, or frustration can become especially vulnerable to these messages. The concern expressed by many observers in the Sahel is not directed at religion itself. Religion has long played an important role in African societies, providing guidance, stability, and community. The concern is focused on individuals who distort religious teachings for political purposes. When faith becomes a tool for division rather than unity, the consequences can reach far beyond places of worship. Social tensions can increase, communities can become polarized, and national security can be affected. For this reason, debates surrounding extremist religious figures are no longer viewed solely as religious matters. Increasingly, they are being discussed as questions of social stability, public security, and national cohesion. But if extremist narratives can influence society from within, who benefits when these divisions grow stronger? That question leads us directly into the geopolitical dimension of the story. The idea that religion can be transformed into a geopolitical tool is not new. Throughout modern history, powerful actors have often discovered that influencing minds can be more effective than controlling territory. A country does not always need to be invaded to be weakened. Sometimes it is enough to create mistrust, confusion, and internal division. When citizens begin fighting one another over identity, ideology, or religion, national unity can slowly erode from within. This is why many analysts describe modern influence campaigns as a form of warfare without conventional weapons. Several international examples are frequently cited in these discussions. In Afghanistan, competing powers spent decades supporting different groups in pursuit of strategic objectives. The consequences extended far beyond military operations and left deep social and ideological divisions that continued for generations. Iraq experienced a similar challenge. As state institutions weakened, extremist organizations exploited religious and social grievances to recruit followers and expand their influence. The battle was not only for territory, it was also for loyalty, identity, and legitimacy. Syria offers another example. What began as a domestic crisis eventually attracted numerous external actors, each pursuing its own interests. Religion, media narratives, and political messaging became powerful instruments in a conflict that transformed the region. For many observers in the Sahel, these examples provide an important warning. The concern is not that religion itself is responsible for instability. The concern is that religious language can sometimes be manipulated by actors pursuing goals that have little to do with faith. Another issue frequently discussed is the role of external funding networks. When educational institutions, religious organizations, or influential figures receive support from outside sources, questions naturally arise. Who is providing the funding? What ideas accompany it? What long-term objectives may be involved? These questions do not automatically imply wrongdoing. However, they highlight the importance of transparency. As the Alliance of Sahel States strengthens its political and security cooperation, many citizens are beginning to ask whether the struggle for sovereignty now extends beyond borders and battlefields into the realm of information, influence, and belief itself. Why has this debate become so intense at this particular moment? To answer that question, we need to look beyond religion and examine the broader political transformation taking place across the Sahel. Over the past few years, Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger have pursued a path that differs significantly from previous regional approaches. Together, they created the Alliance of Sahel States, strengthened military cooperation, and announced plans aimed at increasing control over their own security, resources, and political future. At the same time, the three countries chose to distance themselves from structures they believed no longer reflected their national interests. Supporters of this strategy describe it as a movement toward greater sovereignty. Critics argue it carries significant risks, Regardless of perspective, few would deny that the political landscape of West Africa is changing. This transformation raises an important geopolitical question. When a region begins redefining its relationships, challenging existing arrangements, and asserting greater independence, does it also become a target for new forms of pressure? History suggests that major political shifts are rarely uncontested. Economic pressure, information campaigns, diplomatic disputes, and social divisions often emerge alongside periods of change. For this reason, some analysts believe that growing religious controversies should not be viewed in isolation. Instead, they may be part of a larger environment in which competing interests seek influence over public opinion. This does not mean every disagreement is orchestrated from outside the region. Societies naturally experience political and religious debates. However, it is also true that external actors often attempt to amplify existing tensions when doing so serves their strategic interests. For supporters of AES, this possibility is especially concerning. They argue that military victories can be undermined if social unity collapses. A nation that is divided internally becomes more vulnerable regardless of how strong its armed forces may be. Whether one agrees with this interpretation or not, the timing remains difficult to ignore. As AES seeks greater control over its future, questions about influence, identity, and national cohesion have become more prominent than ever before. This brings us to another critical question. How do the leaders of AES themselves view the relationship between religion, sovereignty, and national security? The leaders of the Alliance of Sahel States have repeatedly argued that the central issue is not religion itself. Instead, they focus on the question of how religion can be exploited by individuals or networks pursuing political objectives. This distinction is important because Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger are societies where faith plays a major role in everyday life. Millions of citizens practice their beliefs peacefully and contribute to the stability of their communities. For this reason, framing the debate as a conflict between governments and religion would be misleading. From the perspective of AES leaders, the real concern emerges when religious influence is used to challenge national cohesion, weaken public institutions, or encourage hostility between communities. Captain Ibrahim Traore has frequently emphasized the importance of national unity and sovereignty. His broader message suggests that a country cannot fully control its future if outside actors are able to shape public opinion, social values, or political behavior from within. Assimi Goïta has expressed similar concerns through the lens of security. After years of conflict in Mali, many policymakers have concluded that extremist violence does not appear suddenly. It often develops through long processes of ideological influence, see recruitment, and social conditioning. In Niger, Abdourahmane Tiani has also stressed the importance of protecting national independence. For supporters of his government, sovereignty extends beyond military control. It includes control over information, education, and the institutions that influence future generations. What unites these three leaders is a common belief that national security can no longer be defined only by borders and military strength. A nation may defend its territory successfully, while still facing pressure through ideas, narratives, and external influence networks. Whether one agrees with their policies or not, their position is relatively clear. The debate is not about which religion citizens follow. The debate is about who influences those citizens, what interests are being served, and whether those influences strengthen or weaken national sovereignties. These views have generated strong support among some Africans. They have also generated significant criticism from Western governments, media organizations, and human rights groups. The debate surrounding religion, extremism, and national sovereignty has not remained confined to the Sahel. It has also attracted significant attention from Western governments, international organizations, media outlets, and human rights groups. Critics often argue that measures taken by governments in Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger risk limiting religious freedom or restricting civil liberties. Some observers express concern that efforts to combat extremism could unintentionally affect peaceful religious communities or reduce space for public debate. These concerns should not be dismissed outright. Every government faces the challenge of protecting security while preserving fundamental rights. A successful strategy requires balance. Citizens must be protected from violence, but they must also retain the freedom to practice their faith peacefully and express legitimate opinions without fear. At the same time, supporters of AES raise a different question. They argue that outside observers sometimes underestimate the realities faced by countries that have endured years of terrorist attacks, mass displacement, and social instability. From this perspective, the threat is not religion itself, but the deliberate manipulation of religion for political and strategic purposes. This is where the disagreement becomes most visible. One side emphasizes civil liberties and individual rights. The other emphasizes national security, sovereignty, and social cohesion. Both concerns are important, and neither can be ignored. The real challenge for AES may therefore be finding a path that protects freedom while preventing extremist networks from exploiting that freedom to spread division and violence. How these governments manage that balance will influence not only their own future, but also the lessons that other African nations may choose to follow in the years ahead. As we reach the end of this discussion, one conclusion becomes increasingly difficult to ignore. The future of the Sahel may depend not only on military victories, but also on the ability of societies to protect their unity from forces that seek to divide them. Throughout history, extremist movements have understood a simple truth. It is often easier to influence minds than to conquer territory. A nation can defend its borders and still face serious challenges if mistrust, fear, and division begin spreading among its people. This is why the debate surrounding extremist religious narratives extends far beyond questions of faith. At its core, it is a discussion about sovereignty, social stability, and national resilience. The issue is not whether religion should have a place in society. Religion remains an essential part of the lives of millions across Africa. The real question is whether religious influence is being used to strengthen communities or to weaken them from within. For Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger, the challenge will be finding a balance between protecting religious freedom and preventing extremist ideologies from exploiting that freedom. Success will require transparency, education, responsible leadership, and strong institutions that earn the trust of ordinary citizens. The lessons emerging from the Sahel may eventually resonate across the continent. Other African nations are watching closely as the Alliance of Sahel states attempts to define a new path based on sovereignty, security, and self-determination. Whether one supports or opposes every decision made by AES, the broader conversation is becoming impossible to ignore. The struggle for Africa's future is no longer only about territory or resources. It is also about ideas, identity, and independence. For many supporters of Pan-African values, the developments in Burkina Faso have become part of a larger Africa new conversation about sovereignty and self-reliance. Figures such as Captain Ibrahim Traore and Ibrahim Traore have become symbols within debates surrounding Pan-Africanism, the future of the African Union, and Africa's role in shaping its own destiny. If you found this analysis valuable, subscribe to the channel, share this video with you, and join the discussion about the future of Africa. Have you ever imagined a sitting African president publicly telling the world to stop pressuring Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger? That is exactly what happened when Gabon's president, Brice Oligui Nguema, delivered a statement that immediately caught the attention of observers across Africa and beyond. While many international leaders continue to criticize the military-led governments of the Sahel, Oligui chose a very different approach. Instead of demanding faster elections or stronger sanctions, he sent a simple but powerful message: leave them alone. For years, Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger have faced constant scrutiny from Western governments, regional organizations, and international media. Their leaders are frequently questioned about transition timelines, elections, and democratic reforms. Yet Oligui argued that these nations should be allowed to focus on the challenges directly affecting their people. What made this statement so surprising is that Oligui is not part of the alliance of Sahel states. Gabon is not a member of AES. Unlike some leaders who openly oppose Western influence, Oligui maintains working relationships with both African institutions and Western partners. That is why his comments carried unusual weight. Was this simply a diplomatic gesture, or does it reveal a deeper shift taking place across Africa? Could more African leaders be quietly moving closer to the ideas promoted by Ibrahim Traore, Assimi Goïta, and Abdourahmane Tiani? The answer may be far more important than many people realize. The controversy began when Oligui was asked about the military governments in the Sahel. Instead of criticizing them, he challenged the constant attention they receive. According to him, the world keeps talking about these countries while ignoring the difficult realities they face every day. His message was straightforward. If the international community truly wants peace and stability, it should stop treating these nations as problems to be managed and start respecting them as sovereign states. To understand why Oligui Nguema's statement generated such a strong reaction, we first need to understand the pressure facing the alliance of Sahel states. Since the military takeovers in Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger, the three countries have been under constant scrutiny from regional organizations and Western governments. Critics argue that military leaders should quickly organize elections and return power to civilian authorities. Supporters of these demands claim that democratic institutions are essential for long-term stability and economic development. The pressure has come from several directions. ECOWAS imposed sanctions and, in the case of Niger, even discussed the possibility of military intervention after the 2023 coup. The African Union suspended the affected countries from certain activities and repeatedly called for constitutional order to be restored. Meanwhile, Western governments, including France, the United States, and members of the European Union urged clear transition timelines and democratic reforms. From the perspective of AES leaders, however, these demands often ignore the reality on the ground. Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger are facing some of the most severe security challenges in the world. Armed extremist groups continue to threaten communities, disrupt economic activity, and force millions of people from their homes. This is where the debate becomes complicated. Supporters of the international position argue that security problems should not be used as a reason to delay democracy indefinitely. They fear that military governments could become permanent governments. On the other hand, supporters of AES ask a different question. How can a country conduct truly meaningful elections when large parts of its territory remain insecure? For many citizens in the Sahel, the priority is not political theory. It is safety, stability, food security, education, electricity, healthcare, and functioning public services. This reality helps explain why Oligui's comments resonated with so many people. He was not necessarily rejecting democracy. He was questioning whether constant external pressure is helping these nations solve the urgent problems facing their populations today. Why, then, would Oligui Nguema choose to defend the right of AES nations to determine their own path? The answer begins with his own political experience. In August of 2023, Oligui himself came to power after a military takeover in Gabon. Like the leaders of Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger, he immediately faced questions from the international community. Many observers wanted to know whether Gabon would quickly return to constitutional rule or become another country trapped in an endless transition. Instead of rejecting those concerns, Oligui pursued a different strategy. Gabon launched a transition process, organized constitutional reforms, and eventually held elections. As a result, he understands both sides of the debate better than most leaders on the continent. This background helps explain why he speaks about AES with caution rather than condemnation. For Oligui, the central issue appears to be sovereignty. His argument is not that elections are unimportant. In fact, he has repeatedly stated that elections contribute to peace, stability, and political legitimacy. What he rejects is the idea that foreign actors should dictate exactly when and how sovereign African nations must organize their political transitions. This position aligns with a broader principle that is becoming increasingly influential across Africa. African problems require African solutions. According to this view, regional institutions and African leaders should take the lead in addressing continental challenges. Outside partners can offer advice and support, but they should avoid imposing decisions that belong to African citizens and governments. There is also a strategic dimension to Oligui's position. Unlike some leaders who openly confront Western governments, he maintains diplomatic relationships with multiple sides. He speaks with Western partners. He engages with African institutions. At the same time, he refuses to isolate AES. That balance gives him a unique role. Rather than acting as an opponent of either side, Oligui increasingly presents himself as a bridge between competing visions for Africa's future. His message is simple, but powerful dialogue achieves more than pressure, and respect achieves more than isolation. Among the leaders of the Alliance of Sahel States, no figure has attracted more international attention than Captain Ibrahim Traore of Burkina Faso. Since taking power, Traore has consistently promoted a message centered on sovereignty, national dignity, and economic independence. He argues that African nations must regain control over their resources, make decisions based on their own interests, and reject policies imposed from outside. Whether people agree with him or not, there is no denying that his message has resonated with millions across the continent. This is why Oligui Nguema's statement matters so much. By publicly calling for greater respect toward Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger, Oligui indirectly strengthens the legitimacy of leaders such as Traore, Assimi Goïta, and Abdourahmane Tiani. He does not endorse every policy they pursue. Instead, he validates a core principle that they have repeatedly defended the right of African nations to choose their own path. For Traore, this is particularly significant. Critics often portray him as isolated or supported only by governments that already share his views. Oligui's intervention challenges that narrative. Here is a leader from outside AES, a president who maintains diplomatic ties with Western countries, arguing that the Sahel governments deserve respect rather than constant pressure. The same dynamic applies to Mali and Niger. Assimi Goïta has spent years promoting strategic independence and reducing reliance on traditional foreign partners. Abdourahmane Tiani has resisted intense international pressure since the political changes in Niger. Both leaders can now point to Oligui's comments as evidence that concerns about sovereignty extend far beyond the borders of AES. Perhaps the most important development is psychological. Across Africa, more people are beginning to ask whether the future of the continent should be defined primarily by external expectations or by African priorities. In that sense, Oliguy's remarks are not only about 3 countries in the Sahel, they are about a growing conversation concerning identity, independence, and Africa's place in a changing world. What makes Oligui Nguema's statement even more significant is that it may reflect a broader transformation taking place across Africa. For decades, many African governments operated within political and economic frameworks heavily influenced by former colonial powers, international financial institutions, and foreign strategic interests. Today, however, a growing number of leaders and citizens are questioning whether those arrangements have delivered the results they expected. This does not necessarily mean that African countries are turning against the West. The reality is more nuanced. Many governments still value partnerships with Europe, the United States, and other international actors. What is changing is the demand for greater balance and greater respect for national priorities. The rise of AES has become one of the most visible symbols of this shift. Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger have placed sovereignty at the center of their political messaging. They argue that security, control over natural resources, and independent decision-making must come before external approval. At the same time, countries outside AES are beginning to pay attention. Some leaders may not support military takeovers, but they understand the frustrations that fuel popular support for stronger sovereignty. This explains why comments like those made by Oligui resonate across the continent. The larger question is whether Africa is entering a new political era, an era where governments seek partnerships without dependence, an era where African leaders negotiate from a position of greater confidence, an era where national interests take precedence over geopolitical pressure. No one can yet say how far this trend will go, but one thing is becoming increasingly clear. The debate is no longer limited to Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger. It is evolving into a continent-wide conversation about power, dignity, development, and the future direction of Africa itself. Of course, not everyone welcomed Oligui Nguema's comments. In fact, many observers in Western capitals would likely disagree with parts of his message. Their concerns are not entirely without merit. Why, critics argue that military governments should never become a long-term substitute for democratic institutions. They point out that elections, independent courts, free media, and political competition are essential safeguards against the concentration of power. From this perspective, delaying political transitions creates risks that cannot be ignored. There are also concerns about human rights, accountability, and transparency. Some international organizations fear that without strong oversight, governments may become less responsive to public criticism and less willing to tolerate political opposition. These concerns explain why Western governments continue to emphasize elections and constitutional rule when discussing the future of Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger. However, supporters of AES offer an equally important counterargument. They ask a simple question: can democracy truly flourish where insecurity dominates daily life? In many parts of the Sahel, communities continue to face violence, displacement, and economic hardship. Schools have closed, businesses struggle to operate. Families are forced to focus on survival rather than political participation. Under these conditions, many citizens believe that restoring security must come before organizing complex national elections. This is where the debate becomes most interesting. It is not necessarily a choice between democracy and security. The real challenge is finding a path that allows both to develop together. Perhaps this is the deeper meaning behind Oligui's statement. Rather than rejecting democratic principles, he may be urging the international community to recognize local realities. Instead of demanding immediate solutions from outside, he suggests giving African nations the space to address their own circumstances. The lesson for other African countries is clear. Sovereignty should never become an excuse for poor governance. At the same time, external pressure should never replace genuine national dialogue. Sustainable progress requires both responsibility and respect. As the debate continues, one fact remains impossible to ignore. A single statement from Gabon's President Brice Oligui Nguema has opened a much larger conversation about the future of Africa. When Oligui told the world to leave Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger alone, he was not simply defending three governments, he was challenging a long-standing assumption that Africa's political choices must always be measured according to standards designed elsewhere. Whether one agrees with him or not, his message has forced many people to reconsider how sovereignty, democracy, security, and development should interact in today's Africa. The significance of this moment extends far beyond the borders of the Sahel. The alliance of Sahel states has become a symbol of a broader movement demanding greater control over national resources, stronger political independence, and a larger African voice in global affairs. Leaders such as Captain Ibrahim Traore have become central figures in that discussion, while others, including Oligui, are helping to bring those ideas into mainstream continental debate. At the same time, important questions remain unanswered. Can AES successfully balance security and democratic governance? Can African nations strengthen sovereignty while preserving accountability and political freedoms? And can the African Union create solutions that reduce tensions without deepening divisions? Perhaps these questions define what many people call an Africa New Era. An era shaped by confidence, self-determination, and renewed debate about the future of the continent. Whether through Pan-African cooperation, Pan-Africanism, or new approaches to regional leadership, the conversation is evolving rapidly. What is certain is that Burkina Faso, Captain Ibrahim Traore, the African Union, and leaders such as Oligui Nguema are now part of a historic discussion that could influence the next generation of African politics. If you believe Africa's future should be shaped by Africans themselves, subscribe to the channel, share this video, and tell us your thoughts in the comments below. For years, Captain Ibrahim Traore has been known as the leader standing at the center of Burkina Faso's fight against terrorism. His name has often been associated with military operations, national security, and the effort to restore stability across the country. But in 2026, a different kind of battle is beginning to attract attention. This new battle is not being fought with weapons. It is being fought with knowledge, savings, investment, and economic participation. The Second International African Stock Exchange Fair, known as CBE 2026, has introduced a conversation that goes far beyond finance. At the heart of the event is a simple but powerful question. Who should finance the future of Burkina Faso foreign institutions and outside investors? Or the people of Burkina Faso themselves? Supporters of this vision believe that true sovereignty extends beyond national borders. They argue that a country cannot be fully independent if it depends heavily on external funding to build its future. This is why CBE 2026 has attracted attention as more than a financial gathering. For many observers, it represents a new front in the broader struggle for economic sovereignty. If you enjoy learning about the major transformations shaping Africa today, make sure to subscribe to the channel and follow our future reports. To understand why this idea is gaining momentum, it is important to look at the challenges facing Burkina Faso. Since 2022, the country has devoted significant resources to security and reconstruction efforts, These priorities require substantial funding, yet military victories alone cannot guarantee long-term independence. A nation may secure its territory while remaining financially dependent on others. This reality has led to growing discussions about economic sovereignty, where protecting national interests means not only defending land, but also strengthening the ability to finance development through domestic resources and citizen participation. SIBA 2026 was presented under a simple but highly strategic theme: financial markets and financial inclusion. The central question was equally straightforward. How can the stock market be brought closer to ordinary people? For decades, financial markets across much of Africa have often been viewed as spaces reserved for wealthy investors, large corporations, and financial professionals. Many citizens have never owned a share, purchased a bond, or participated in any formal investment activity. As a result, millions of people save money without ever becoming part of the broader economic growth that their savings could help create. This is precisely the challenge that SIBA 2026 seeks to address. According to the organizers, the objective is not merely to promote stock exchanges. It is to change perceptions. The event aims to demonstrate that investment opportunities should not be limited to a privileged few. Instead, financial participation should be accessible to students preparing for their future, farmers seeking greater financial security, market traders building small businesses, and workers hoping to create long-term wealth for their families. This represents a significant shift in thinking. Rather than focusing exclusively on attracting foreign investors, the discussion increasingly centers on empowering domestic investors. The goal is to help citizens understand how financial markets work and how they can participate responsibly. For supporters of this approach, every citizen who learns to invest becomes more than a saver. That person becomes a contributor to national development. Small investments, when multiplied across thousands or even millions of people, can help finance businesses, infrastructure projects, and economic growth. In this sense, SIBA 2026 is more than a financial exhibition. It is an effort to democratize investment and transform ordinary citizens into active participants in building Burkina Faso's economic future. One of the most important ideas behind Burkina Faso's emerging economic strategy is the belief that savings should not remain idle. Across Africa, millions of people save money every month. They put aside small amounts from salaries, business income, farming activities, or family support. Yet, much of this money never reaches the productive sectors of the economy. This creates a significant gap between personal savings and national development. Supporters of financial inclusion argue that when savings are transformed into investments, they become a powerful engine for growth. Instead of remaining inactive, these resources can help finance roads, energy projects, housing developments, schools, and businesses that create jobs. This philosophy is visible in Burkina Faso's recent efforts to mobilize resources from its citizens and its diaspora. One notable example is the Diaspora Bonds Initiative, which seeks to encourage Burkinabe living abroad to contribute directly to national development through structured investment programs. Rather than relying exclusively on external lenders, the country is exploring ways to channel the commitment and financial capacity of its own people. The significance of this approach extends beyond the amount of money raised. It represents a different vision of development. A worker living overseas is no longer viewed simply as someone sending money home to relatives. That individual can also become an investor in national infrastructure and economic transformation. Even relatively small investments can have meaningful collective impact when participation becomes widespread. Thousands of citizens contributing modest amounts may ultimately generate resources capable of supporting major development projects. For advocates of economic sovereignty, this is where the real power lies. National development becomes a shared responsibility rather than a process driven primarily by foreign capital. In that sense, every saver has the potential to become a nation builder, and every investment can become a contribution to the future of Burkina Faso. Many experts believe that financial education may be the most important element of any long-term strategy for economic sovereignty. A country can create investment opportunities, launch financial programs, and encourage citizen participation. However, if people do not understand how money works, these efforts will have limited impact. This challenge is not unique to Burkina Faso. Across many countries, people spend years studying mathematics, history, science, and literature without ever receiving practical education about savings, investing, risk management, or wealth creation. As adults, they are expected to make important financial decisions despite having little formal preparation. This is one reason why discussions at SYBA 2026 have extended beyond stock markets and investment products. There is growing interest in promoting financial literacy among younger generations and introducing financial education into schools and universities. The goal is not to turn every student into a stock trader. Instead, it is to help future citizens understand fundamental concepts that can improve their economic security. Learning how investments work, understanding the relationship between risk and return, and recognizing the importance of long-term planning can empower individuals throughout their lives. For young entrepreneurs, financial knowledge can improve business decisions. For workers, it can support retirement planning. For families, it can help build greater stability across generations. Supporters of this approach argue that economic development begins with informed citizens. Roads, factories, and infrastructure remain important, but human knowledge is equally valuable. A population that understands finance is better equipped to save, invest, and participate in national growth. In the long run, the most significant achievement may not be the number of people who purchase stocks or bonds. It may be the creation of a generation capable of making informed financial decisions and taking greater control of its economic future. As Burkina Faso advances its vision of economic sovereignty, not everyone is convinced that the path will be easy. Critics, particularly in parts of the Western media and policy community, have raised concerns about governance, political freedoms, and the long-term stability of the country's institutions. Some observers argue that strong economic ambitions must be accompanied by strong democratic institutions, transparent regulations, and reliable legal protections. From this perspective, attracting investment requires more than patriotic enthusiasm. It requires confidence that financial markets will operate fairly and that investors will have access to accurate information. These concerns deserve consideration. A successful financial market depends heavily on trust. Citizens will only invest their savings if they believe their money is protected and if they understand the risks involved. Transparency, accountability, and effective oversight are therefore essential components of any strategy designed to expand public participation in finance. At the same time, supporters of Burkina Faso's current direction argue that many international discussions focus heavily on political controversies while paying less attention to efforts aimed at increasing domestic economic participation. They point out that encouraging citizens to invest, promoting financial education, and mobilizing local savings are legitimate development goals that deserve serious examination. The debate, therefore, is not simply about politics, it is also about development strategy. Can a country strengthen economic sovereignty while improving transparency and investor confidence at the same time? This may be one of the most important questions facing Burkina Faso in the years ahead. If the country succeeds, it could demonstrate that domestic capital and citizen participation can play a larger role in national development. If it fails, critics will argue that ambitious rhetoric alone cannot replace the institutions required for long-term financial growth. The challenge is not choosing between sovereignty and transparency. The real challenge is ensuring that both advance together. The discussion taking place in Burkina Faso extends far beyond one country. Across Africa, governments continue to face a common challenge. Development requires capital. Yet access to financing often depends heavily on external loans, foreign investment, and international institutions. This reality has led many policymakers to ask whether a greater share of development could be financed through domestic resources. In this context, Burkina Faso's efforts offer several lessons that may interest other African nations. The first lesson is the importance of mobilizing local savings. Every country possesses financial resources within its own population. While individual contributions may appear small, collective participation can create significant pools of capital capable of supporting national priorities. The second lesson involves financial education. Citizens cannot participate effectively in financial markets if they do not understand the basic principles of investing, risk management, and long-term wealth creation. Expanding financial literacy may therefore be just as important as creating new investment products. A third lesson concerns trust. No market can thrive without confidence. Governments seeking to attract domestic investors must demonstrate transparency, accountability, and responsible management of public resources. Citizens are far more likely to invest when they believe institutions are credible and reliable. Another important lesson is that economic sovereignty does not require isolation. Countries can strengthen domestic financial systems while remaining open to regional and international cooperation. The objective is not to reject outside capital, but to engage with it from a position of greater strength and confidence. For many supporters of Pan-African development, this represents an important evolution in thinking. Economic independence is no longer viewed solely through the lens of natural resources or political autonomy. It increasingly includes financial literacy, citizen participation, domestic investment, and the ability to mobilize capital from within society itself. Whether Burkina Faso ultimately succeeds or struggles, its experiment is already contributing to a larger conversation about how African nations can shape their own economic futures in the decades ahead. As CEBA 2026 comes to a close, the most important question is not whether the event was successful. The real question is whether the ideas discussed there can reshape the future of Burkina Faso. For years, Ibrahim Traore has been associated with the struggle to defend national territory and restore security. Today, a new dimension is being added to that story. The conversation is expanding from military sovereignty to economic sovereignty. The objective is no longer limited to protecting borders. It now includes strengthening the country's ability to mobilize its own resources, educate its citizens, and finance its own development. CEBA 2026 symbolizes this broader ambition. It reflects an effort to bring financial markets closer to ordinary people and to challenge the belief that investing is reserved for a privileged minority. Farmers, students, traders, workers, and members of the diaspora are increasingly being invited into a conversation that was once dominated by specialists. Yet, success will depend on more than ambition. Economic sovereignty requires transparency, strong institutions, financial education, and public trust. Citizens must not only be encouraged to invest, they must also be equipped with the knowledge needed to make informed decisions and protect their financial future. The significance of this discussion extends beyond Burkina Faso. Across the continent, nations continue to search for ways to reduce dependency and strengthen their economic foundations. The ideas emerging from SIBA contribute to a larger debate about how Africa can finance its own development while remaining engaged with the wider world, whether one supports or questions the approach. One fact is difficult to ignore. A new conversation is taking shape across Africa. It is a conversation about ownership, participation, and responsibility. As Pan-African aspirations continue to evolve, Burkina Faso has placed an important question before the continent. Can citizens become investors in their own future? For Captain Ibrahim Traore, supporters of Pan-Africanism, advocates of the African Union, and those who believe in an Africa new, the answer may help define the next chapter of Africa's economic journey. For decades, the Sahel was portrayed as one of the harshest regions on Earth. International reports often highlighted drought, food shortages, and advancing desert conditions. Many experts believed that modern agriculture could never truly flourish in this environment. The idea that apples, strawberries, coffee, or cocoa could grow here seemed almost impossible. Yet today, Burkina Faso is challenging that belief. Across parts of the country, experimental farms are producing crops that were once considered unsuitable for the region. Farmers are testing apples. Agricultural centers are cultivating coffee and cocoa seedlings. Strawberries and pineapples are appearing in places where many people expected only dry soil and limited harvests. This transformation is attracting attention far beyond Burkina Faso. Supporters see it as proof that determination, technology, and smart resource management can overcome barriers once considered permanent. Critics remain cautious, arguing that many projects are still in their early stages. But regardless of the debate, one fact is clear: the country is attempting something few thought possible. In this video, we will explore how Ibrahim Traore's vision is helping Burkina Faso challenge decades of assumptions about the Sahel. We will examine the agricultural projects, the infrastructure behind them, and the larger message they send to Africa and the world. If you enjoy stories about transformation, resilience, and the future of Africa, be sure to follow the channel for more content like this. For many years, the Sahel was associated with limitation. The region's dry climate led many observers to conclude that large-scale agricultural success was out of reach. Development discussions often focused on managing scarcity rather than creating abundance. Burkina Faso became part of this narrative. Despite having a population deeply connected to farming, the country was frequently viewed through the lens of drought and food insecurity. Many believed its agricultural future would always be constrained by nature. However, that assumption overlooked an important reality. Climate is only one part of the equation. Water management, irrigation systems, improved seeds, infrastructure, and political commitment can dramatically change agricultural outcomes. Around the world, productive farming regions have emerged in places once considered difficult for cultivation. Burkina Faso is now attempting a similar transformation. Instead of accepting old predictions, it is exploring new possibilities. The question is no longer whether the Sahel faces challenges. The question is whether those challenges are truly permanent. That is the idea now being tested across fields, farms, and agricultural projects throughout Burkina Faso. To Ibrahim Traore, agriculture is not simply an economic sector. It is a matter of national independence. Burkina Faso possesses significant mineral wealth, particularly gold. For years, gold exports generated revenue. Yet, the country still faced recurring concerns about food security. This created a contradiction that many African nations know well. A country may possess valuable natural resources, But if it cannot reliably feed its people, its sovereignty remains vulnerable. Traore's response has been direct and consistent. He argues that true independence begins with the ability to produce food domestically. A nation that depends heavily on outside sources for basic necessities can easily find itself exposed to economic pressure, market disruptions, or geopolitical uncertainty. This philosophy has become a central pillar of Burkina Faso's development strategy. Rather than viewing agriculture as a secondary activity, the government has elevated it to a national priority. Investments have been directed toward farming equipment, irrigation systems, improved seeds, and agricultural infrastructure. The objective is not only to increase production, but also to reduce dependence on imported food. What makes this approach particularly significant is its long-term perspective. Gold can generate income, but agricultural development creates broader benefits. It supports rural communities, creates employment opportunities, strengthens local industries, and improves national resilience. For Traore, the question is not whether gold is important. The question is whether mineral wealth alone can guarantee a secure future. His answer appears to be no. Instead, he is promoting a model in which natural resources support productive sectors that directly improve the lives of ordinary citizens. In this vision, food security becomes more than an agricultural goal. It becomes a foundation for economic stability, national confidence, and genuine self-reliance. That belief helps explain why Burkina Faso's agricultural transformation is receiving so much attention. It is not merely about growing more crops. It is about redefining what independence means in the modern era. The most surprising part of Burkina Faso's agricultural transformation is not the expansion of rice fields or the increase in cereal production. It is the appearance of crops that many experts once considered impossible for the Sahel. For generations, apples were associated with the cooler climates of Europe and North America. Coffee was linked to specific highland regions with favorable temperatures and rainfall. Cocoa was traditionally connected to the humid coastal zones of West Africa. Strawberries were viewed as delicate crops, requiring conditions rarely associated with the dry landscapes of Burkina Faso. Yet today, agricultural centers across the country are experimenting with all of them. The significance of these projects extends far beyond the number of fruits harvested. Even when production remains limited, the symbolic value is enormous. Every successful seedling challenges a belief that has existed for decades. Every fruit produced under Sahel conditions raises new questions about what the region may be capable of achieving in the future. Among the most striking examples is the cultivation of apples. The sight of apple trees growing in Burkina Faso creates an immediate sense of disbelief, because it directly contradicts assumptions that many people have accepted for years. Similar reactions follow reports of strawberries, coffee seedlings, and cocoa plants being tested in agricultural programs. Pineapples have become another powerful symbol. In areas once known primarily for dry conditions, farmers are demonstrating that with irrigation, careful management, and appropriate techniques, crops previously considered unsuitable can survive and even thrive. What makes these experiments important is not the idea that Burkina Faso will suddenly become one of the world's largest producers of apples or coffee. The deeper significance lies elsewhere. These projects represent a shift in mindset. They suggest that development is not always limited by old maps, outdated assumptions, or inherited expectations. Instead, progress often begins when people decide to test the boundaries of what they have been told is possible. In that sense, the apples, strawberries, coffee, and pineapples emerging from Burkina Faso are more than agricultural products. They are symbols of a country attempting to redefine its future. At first glance, the emergence of apples, strawberries, And coffee in Burkina Faso may seem almost miraculous. But the real story is not about miracles. It is about infrastructure, planning, and a deliberate effort to overcome long-standing agricultural barriers. One of the most important factors behind this transformation is water. For decades, large portions of Burkina Faso possessed agricultural potential that remained underutilized because water resources were not effectively managed. Today, irrigation projects, reservoirs, dams, and water distribution systems are changing that reality. In several regions, water can now be delivered to farms throughout much of the year, reducing dependence on unpredictable rainfall. This creates opportunities for farmers to experiment with crops that would have struggled under traditional conditions. Technology also plays a major role. Solar-powered pumps, improved irrigation methods, and modern farming equipment are helping increase efficiency and productivity. Tasks that once required enormous amounts of manual labor can now be completed more effectively, allowing farmers to expand cultivation and improve yields. Another critical element is agricultural expertise. New seeds, improved farming techniques, and closer cooperation between specialists and local producers have helped accelerate progress. Rather than relying solely on traditional methods, many projects combine local experience with modern agricultural knowledge. Equally important is organization. Large-scale transformation rarely occurs through individual effort alone. It requires coordination between farmers, engineers, institutions, and policymakers. Burkina Faso's agricultural initiatives reflect an attempt to align these different actors around a common objective: greater food security and agricultural self-reliance. This is why the story extends beyond apples or strawberries. Those crops attract attention because they are unexpected. However, they are only visible symbols of a broader strategy that includes irrigation infrastructure, mechanization, training programs, and long-term planning. The lesson is clear. What appears impossible from a distance often becomes achievable when the right systems are put in place. The fields of Burkina Faso are demonstrating that agricultural success is not determined by climate alone. It is also shaped by investment, innovation, and the willingness to challenge old assumptions. The transformation taking place in Burkina Faso can be measured through statistics, infrastructure projects, and agricultural programs. Yet some of the most powerful evidence comes from images that capture a changing national mindset. One of those images is the sight of pineapples growing in areas long associated with dry conditions. For many observers, these fruits have become symbols of possibility. They represent the idea that with determination and innovation, even difficult environments can produce unexpected results. Another striking image is that of Ibrahim Traore walking through farms and agricultural facilities. Whether inspecting fields, meeting producers, or visiting processing plants. These appearances reinforce the message that agriculture is not a secondary issue. It stands at the center of the country's development strategy. There is also the unusual image of military personnel participating in agricultural activities. Traditionally, armies are associated with security operations. In Burkina Faso, however, agriculture has increasingly been presented as part of a broader effort to strengthen national resilience. The message is clear: protecting a nation includes helping secure its food supply. Beyond the fields, modern processing facilities are becoming new symbols of progress. Producing crops is only part of the challenge. Processing, packaging, and adding value within the country allow more economic benefits to remain in local communities. Together, these images are helping reshape how many citizens view their future. They suggest a country moving away from narratives of limitation and toward narratives of possibility. Whether every project succeeds or not, The psychological impact is already significant. New symbols are emerging across Burkina Faso. They encourage people to imagine opportunities where previous generations often saw only obstacles. That shift in confidence may ultimately prove just as important as any harvest. As Burkina Faso's agricultural transformation gains international attention, it has also generated debate. Supporters point to expanding irrigation projects, new farming initiatives, and experiments with crops once considered impossible for the Sahel. Critics, however, argue that the achievements are sometimes overstated or presented in overly optimistic terms. One common criticism is that some of the most publicized projects remain relatively small in scale. Skeptics note that a few successful demonstration farms do not automatically guarantee nationwide agricultural transformation. Others argue that challenges such as climate variability, security concerns, and limited financial resources continue to pose serious obstacles. There are also voices in Western media and policy circles that question whether the government's agricultural narrative reflects long-term reality or short-term political messaging. These concerns are part of a broader discussion about development, governance, and economic sustainability. Yet, a balanced assessment requires looking at observable facts. Irrigation systems have been expanded. Agricultural equipment has been distributed. New crops are being tested. Processing facilities have been developed. Regardless of differing political interpretations, these activities are taking place and are producing measurable outcomes. The more important question may not be whether every goal will be achieved exactly as planned. The more important question is whether Burkina Faso is moving in a direction that strengthens food production and national resilience. That debate remains open. However, one thing is difficult to deny. The country has succeeded in drawing attention to a possibility that many once dismissed entirely: the idea that the Sahel can become more productive, more self-reliant, and more ambitious than previously imagined. The story of Burkina Faso's agricultural transformation is still being written. Many challenges remain, and no one can predict with certainty how every project will develop in the years ahead. Yet something important has already changed. A country once described mainly through drought, food shortages, and limitations is now being discussed for apples, strawberries, coffee, and other crops that many people believed could never grow in the Sahel. Whether these experiments remain small or expand significantly, they have already achieved something powerful. They have challenged old assumptions. Perhaps the greatest achievement is not the fruit itself. It is the renewed confidence that comes from proving that obstacles once considered permanent can be questioned and, in some cases, overcome. That confidence is becoming part of a larger conversation across Africa. For many supporters of Pan-African ideals, Burkina Faso represents more than an agricultural project. It represents the belief that African nations can develop solutions based on their own priorities and resources. In that discussion, Captain Ibrahim Traore and Ibrahim Traore have become symbols of a broader movement associated with Pan-Africanism, self-reliance, and a vision of an Africa new. The lessons extend beyond Burkina Faso. Governments, communities, and even institutions such as the African Union may find value in examining how innovation, infrastructure, and determination can reshape expectations. Dépitas. If the future of the Sahel continues to evolve in this direction, the impact could reach far beyond one country. And if you enjoyed this story about change, resilience, and the future of Africa, be sure to follow the channel for more inspiring journeys from across the continent. Have you noticed something unusual happening across the Sahel? While Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger continue to strengthen their position against armed extremist groups, another battle appears to be taking shape far from the front lines. It is not a battle fought with rifles or military vehicles. Instead, It is a battle for influence, ideas, and public perception. In recent months, debates surrounding religion, political authority, and social identity have become increasingly visible across the region. Some see these tensions as normal disagreements within society. Others believe they may be part of a broader effort to weaken the alliance of Sahel states from within. This raises an important question. If extremist groups are finding it harder to achieve their objectives through direct violence, could new strategies be emerging that focus on division rather than confrontation? To understand this concern, we must first examine the changing reality of the Sahel. For years, Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger have faced relentless attacks from armed groups. Villages were targeted, communities displaced, and thousands of families affected by insecurity. In response, the three countries increased military cooperation and created the Alliance of Sahel States, seeking greater control over their own security and future. As military operations expanded, many observers noticed a new challenge beginning to emerge. The struggle was no longer limited to physical territory. Attention increasingly shifted toward information, ideology, and social cohesion. History shows that when direct pressure becomes less effective, efforts often move toward influencing public opinion. A society divided by mistrust can be weakened without a single shot being fired. This is why the growing controversy surrounding extremist religious narratives has attracted so much attention across the Sahel. In the next section, we will examine how extremist messages can transform social frustrations into deeper divisions and why many leaders consider this a major national security concern. Across Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger, discussions about religion have become increasingly sensitive. The reason is simple. Leaders across the Sahel are no longer looking only at armed attacks. They are also examining the ideas that can inspire those attacks. Many security experts argue that extremism rarely begins with violence. It often begins with a narrative. A message is repeated often enough that it slowly changes how people see themselves, their neighbors, and their country. The process usually starts by creating a feeling of victimhood. Individuals are told that their faith is under attack, that their community is being marginalized, or that political leaders are working against their beliefs. Whether these claims are true or not becomes less important than the emotions they create. Once this sense of grievance takes hold, society can begin to divide. People stop seeing themselves primarily as citizens of one nation and begin seeing themselves as members of opposing groups. Trust weakens, suspicion grows. Every government decision is interpreted through a religious or ideological lens. This is where extremist recruiters often find opportunities. They present themselves as defenders of faith, justice, and identity. They offer simple answers to complex problems. Young people facing insecurity, unemployment, or frustration can become especially vulnerable to these messages. The concern expressed by many observers in the Sahel is not directed at religion itself. Religion has long played an important role in African societies, providing guidance, stability, and community. The concern is focused on individuals who distort religious teachings for political purposes. When faith becomes a tool for division rather than unity, the consequences can reach far beyond places of worship. Social tensions can increase, communities can become polarized, and national security can be affected. For this reason, debates surrounding extremist religious figures are no longer viewed solely as religious matters. Increasingly, they are being discussed as questions of social stability, public security, and national cohesion. But if extremist narratives can influence society from within, who benefits when these divisions grow stronger? That question leads us directly into the geopolitical dimension of the story. The idea that religion can be transformed into a geopolitical tool is not new. Throughout modern history, powerful actors have often discovered that influencing minds can be more effective than controlling territory. A country does not always need to be invaded to be weakened. Sometimes it is enough to create mistrust, confusion, and internal division. When citizens begin fighting one another over identity, ideology, or religion, national unity can slowly erode from within. This is why many analysts describe modern influence campaigns as a form of warfare without conventional weapons. Several international examples are frequently cited in these discussions. In Afghanistan, competing powers spent decades supporting different groups in pursuit of strategic objectives. The consequences extended far beyond military operations and left deep social and ideological divisions that continued for generations. Iraq experienced a similar challenge. As state institutions weakened, extremist organizations exploited religious and social grievances to recruit followers and expand their influence. The battle was not only for territory, it was also for loyalty, identity, and legitimacy. Syria offers another example. What began as a domestic crisis eventually attracted numerous external actors, each pursuing its own interests. Religion, media narratives, and political messaging became powerful instruments in a conflict that transformed the region. For many observers in the Sahel, these examples provide an important warning. The concern is not that religion itself is responsible for instability. The concern is that religious language can sometimes be manipulated by actors pursuing goals that have little to do with faith. Another issue frequently discussed is the role of external funding networks. When educational institutions, religious organizations, or influential figures receive support from outside sources, questions naturally arise. Who is providing the funding? What ideas accompany it? What long-term objectives may be involved? These questions do not automatically imply wrongdoing. However, they highlight the importance of transparency. As the Alliance of Sahel States strengthens its political and security cooperation, many citizens are beginning to ask whether the struggle for sovereignty now extends beyond borders and battlefields into the realm of information, influence, and belief itself. Why has this debate become so intense at this particular moment? To answer that question, we need to look beyond religion and examine the broader political transformation taking place across the Sahel. Over the past few years, Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger have pursued a path that differs significantly from previous regional approaches. Together, they created the Alliance of Sahel States, strengthened military cooperation, and announced plans aimed at increasing control over their own security, resources, and political future. At the same time, the three countries chose to distance themselves from structures they believed no longer reflected their national interests. Supporters of this strategy describe it as a movement toward greater sovereignty. Critics argue it carries significant risks. Regardless of perspective, few would deny that the political landscape of West Africa is changing. This transformation raises an important geopolitical question. When a region begins redefining its relationships, challenging existing arrangements, and asserting greater independence, does it also become a target for new forms of pressure? History suggests that major political shifts are rarely uncontested. Economic pressure, information campaigns, diplomatic disputes, and social divisions often emerge alongside periods of change. For this reason, some analysts believe that growing religious controversies should not be viewed in isolation. Instead, they may be part of a larger environment in which competing interests seek influence over public opinion. This does not mean every disagreement is orchestrated from outside the region. Societies naturally experience political and religious debates. However, it is also true that external actors often attempt to amplify existing tensions when doing so serves their strategic interests. For supporters of AES, This possibility is especially concerning. They argue that military victories can be undermined if social unity collapses. A nation that is divided internally becomes more vulnerable regardless of how strong its armed forces may be. Whether one agrees with this interpretation or not, the timing remains difficult to ignore. As AES seeks greater control over its future, questions about influence, identity, and national cohesion have become more prominent than ever before. This brings us to another critical question. How do the leaders of AES themselves view the relationship between religion, sovereignty, and national security? The leaders of the Alliance of Sahel States have repeatedly argued that the central issue is not religion itself. Instead, they focus on the question of how religion can be exploited by individuals or networks pursuing political